Fort Robinson, Nebraska, autumn 1945. A German shepherd named Duke stands rigid in a training yard as a fire truck's siren blasts 20 feet away, engine revving, bell clanging. Weeks earlier, that same sound would have meant nothing to him beyond background noise on a Pacific island, where the real threats came silently, through jungle undergrowth, not sirens. Now handlers watch closely, clipboards in hand, grading his reaction on a scale that will determine whether he goes home to a family in Ohio or spends the rest of his working life in military service. This is not combat training. It is the opposite of it, a deliberate, methodical process of teaching an animal trained to detect danger that the world it is about to re-enter is, for the most part, safe again. This is not where the story of America's war dogs ends. It is where the harder part begins, unwinding what months of combat training had so carefully built. The scale of the program being wound down in 1945 had grown almost accidentally from nothing. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States military owned barely 100 dogs, mostly sled teams stationed in Alaska, and remained openly skeptical that dogs belonged in modern warfare at all. Dogs for Defense, a civilian organization founded by dog show figures and led by American Kennel Club President Harry Caesar, changed that skepticism within months, persuading thousands of American families to donate their own pets to the war effort. Training responsibility eventually passing to the Quartermaster Corps in the summer of 1942. By war's end, thousands of dogs, drawn from ordinary households rather than any military breeding program, had served across every theater, sniffing out mines, carrying messages under fire, and standing guard on Pacific Islands, where a dog's hearing regularly saved a platoon's life before a single shot was fired. But that was only the beginning of the problem the military now faced. Every one of those dogs had come from a family, and when Dogs for Defense stopped procuring new animals in March 1945, and the program officially disbanded that August following Japan's surrender, the military found itself holding an explicit promise it had made to thousands of owners at the very start of the war. Survive, and your dog comes home. The documents reveal something the wartime recruitment posters never fully explained. Fulfilling that promise required almost as much organized effort as training the dogs for combat in the first place. At Fort Robinson, demobilized war dogs were systematically reconditioned to civilian stimuli. Fire truck sirens, police car horns, the grinding noise of construction equipment, sounds a combat-trained dog might otherwise associate with danger and react to unpredictably in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The retraining process, handlers noted at the time, took nearly as long as the original military training had. Weeks of deliberate desensitization before a dog could be certified safe to place in a private home. Picture the yard at Fort Robinson in those months. Rows of dogs that had, only weeks earlier, been sleeping in foxholes beside Marines on Iwo Jima or Guam, now working through a different kind of drill entirely, sitting calmly while a truck engine roared past, learning to distinguish a firecracker from incoming fire, unlearning, one supervised exposure at a time, exactly the hypervigilance that had kept both the dog and its handler alive only months before. Another problem soon emerged, one the planners had not fully anticipated. The military expected a shortage of civilian homes willing to take in a former combat dog. The opposite happened. Dogs for Defense received more than 15,000 adoption applications for a pool of available animals, numbering only in the low thousands. Families competing for the chance to adopt a veteran of a war, most of them had only followed through newspaper headlines and newsreels. Yet the most difficult decisions were never about finding homes. They were about the small number of dogs that retraining simply could not reach. Among the United States Marine Corps war dogs, 559 survived to see the war's end. 540 were successfully returned to civilian life. Of the remaining 19, 15 were euthanized for serious health problems that made adoption impossible. And only 4, out of hundreds that passed through the program, could not be safely retrained for civilian temperament at all. Lieutenant Colonel William Putney, who had commanded Marine war dog platoons in the Pacific, and was appalled to learn that dogs had occasionally been destroyed in the field without proper evaluation, refused afterward to authorize a single dog's euthanasia until every possible avenue for retraining had been exhausted first. What followed for the dogs that made it through was, in its own quiet way, a genuinely successful reintegration, one of the more understated logistical achievements of the entire post-war demobilization effort. Chips, perhaps the most decorated dog of the war, was discharged from active service in December 1945 and returned to the Wren family in Pleasantville, New York, the same household that had donated him years earlier, resuming an ordinary suburban life after surviving campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Programs run through the surplus disposal system returned thousands more, the overwhelming majority successfully readjusting, with only a small fraction ultimately unable to make the transition back. Not every dog got the chance to come home at all. On Guam, 25 war dogs killed retaking the island from Japanese forces in 1944 were never coming back, regardless of what promises had been made. Memorialized afterward at what became the first official war dog cemetery in American military history. A quiet acknowledgement that not every debt owed by this program could be repaid by simply sending an animal home, but one detail from Fort Robinson rarely makes it into the official summaries of the demobilization program. By the final weeks of 1945, the same training yard that had once echoed with deliberately staged fire truck sirens and engine noise fell quiet for long stretches at a time, not because the work was finished, but because there were day by day simply fewer dogs left to process. The war that had filled that yard with combat veterans in need of a second education was ending the same way it had begun: one animal, one family, one careful decision at a time. Debriefing assessed as a demobilization and welfare problem rather than a purely operational one. The return of America's war dogs to civilian life reveals three defining pressures and one enduring institutional lesson. First, the military had made an implicit promise at the war's outset that it had never fully planned how to keep, and honoring it after 1945 required building an entirely new retraining infrastructure from scratch, one designed to undo combat conditioning rather than instill it. Second, civilian demand for adopting former war dogs vastly exceeded the available supply, a rare instance of post-war demobilization, planning underestimating public goodwill rather than public capacity, and one that meaningfully eased what could otherwise have been a much harder placement problem. Third, the small number of dogs that could not be safely returned to civilian life exposed the limits of retraining, however well-intentioned, and the insistence of officers like Putney on exhausting every option before euthanasia set a standard for animal welfare that would shape military working dog policy for decades afterward, imperfectly and unevenly, but decisively all the same. The enduring lesson is one the military would relearn and occasionally forget in the decades that followed. A working dog trained to detect danger does not stop being an animal capable of trust, loyalty, and adjustment the moment its uniform comes off. And the post-war effort to prove that, however improvised and incomplete, set a precedent that later generations of military dog handlers would spend decades fighting to have honored again.